We are slaying monsters.
Don't let the ghosts and the ghouls disturb you, darling.
There's a whole subset of Fortean research that doesn't deal with the things that we normally consider Fortean research to be. Like when I think of this kind of stuff, and you talk about some of the Art Bell and Coast to Coast AM and that kind of stuff, a lot of that ends up being, well, what was going on at Area 51? I saw a Bigfoot, what's in Loch Ness and what's the most haunted place in America, right? And we kind of consider that to be the Fortean sciences, the Fortean research. But to me, there's always been this whole other subset of Fortean research that is the conspiracy theory, especially because so often the conspiracy theory ends up getting wrapped up in this stuff. You have like JFK, right? Like JFK is a conspiracy theory, but that's a little bit different than, oh, by the way, there are secret underground military bases and they might be full of UFOs. And like then it rubs elbows with Fortean and becomes slaying monsters territory.
Right.
Mm-hmm.
Which brings us to where we are today. And it's fascinating too to see so many of them have intersecting ideas.
Yeah, I'm thinking about like chemtrails. I feel like that's a place where like actual things that are happening in the real world, which is like we see trails in the sky sometimes,
yes,
like intersect with what I think would be slaying monsters territory, which people then take it into a very weird place.
We talked about this in a Fortean roundup a couple of months ago, actually, EJ. You and I talked about this, and because there's a bill in one of the, is it Illinois? It's one of the Midwestern states that was trying to ban chemtrails.
Iowa.
Yeah, a bill in Iowa trying to ban chemtrails, and it's like, what are you trying to? Because chemtrails aren't real. I mean, contrails are real. Chemtrails are not real. They're not throwing chemicals up in the sky, But what they are doing is they have massive factory farms in a lot of these Midwestern states, and that's what's poisoning your atmosphere.
It's one of the things.
Yeah. I mean, I was going to say, and maybe like this is how little I know about chemtrails because I don't pay attention to that nonsense. But like, I thought it was like literally the whatever reaction is happening in the air when airplanes fly through the air sometimes and you get the trail after it. Like, that's what people think of as chemtrails, but it's literally just like a natural reaction of the air, right? Like
that's
the temperature of the air or something, right?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, airplane contrails. They're a real thing. It's what happens when planes fly in certain temperatures and there's condensation. And
that's what I thought. Yeah,
I'm not a chemist, but that's how it works. But people say that those are actually gases, and they're spewing out all kind of noxious things that are going to mutate you into something else, or they're spreading vaccines that way, or, oh man, I mean, we're already in that conspiracy theory territory here, man. Here we go.
Unfortunately, they're very similar in name, and I think it really does fool people that don't have the knowledge of what they are. Like, personally, that worked for me. I didn't know that there was a difference between the two until I did some, looking into it.
And so what happens is that gets used as a way to legislate and to propagandize, turn into propaganda, to espouse other ideas, because you can hook people with that, oh, they're spewing shit into your atmosphere, and take them by the hand with that and then lead them down paths to other nefarious things, which is everything that we're going to talk about across this series.
It's a calculated distraction.
Absolutely. Yeah. Yeah. And that's something that we have to be really, really vigilant of, especially right now, because look, the world is in the state it's in, and we have to pay attention to what people are talking about and, more importantly, why they're talking about it.
Yeah, so let's get into it. Welcome to Slaying Monsters, everybody. We got Maddie J here.
Hey.
We have Katie.
Hello.
And I'm EJ, and we're going to get into some shit. I don't know. What's it called? What's this called?
Well, it started as an exploration of Die Glocke, but this is really the story of Nazi occultism. And we are going to talk about World War II, we're going to talk about Nazis, and we're going to talk about all the stories surrounding Nazis' wunderwaffe, the wonder weapons that they allegedly had, that they were allegedly going to use, and what happened to them, where they are today, and maybe where they are not. And in the process of doing this, I also want to talk about conspiracy theories and how conspiracy theories spread and the similarities and differences in this whole mythology that surrounds UFOs, undercover bases, whether or not Hitler fled to Antarctica, and just a whole bunch of, we're going to get into a whole bunch of shit.
And we'd like to say up front, fuck Nazis.
Yes, indeed.
And if you have a problem with that, we don't care.
Yeah.
You can turn this off right now.
Absolutely.
Actually,
that's your right.
You probably should. Honestly, if you have a problem with us saying fuck Nazis, I kind of feel like you probably don't listen to this podcast to begin with. But
that's true.
You came here accidentally.
But yes, I love your stance, Katie. I've actually built a couple places into the script where we will be using that phrase. In the closing days of World War II, the Nazis' backs were up against the wall. Reinhard Heydrich had been assassinated in Poland in a clandestine operation. The Nazis' attempt to take Stalingrad had been met with a surprising show of Russian defiance, leading to an extended conflict in the bitter winter. And a campaign in Italy had pushed German troop reserves to the breaking point. All of this, accompanied with constant Allied bombings of industrial targets, left Hitler on the defensive. Forced to go underground, the remaining Nazi scientists and engineers worked on a last-ditch effort, allegedly a weapon that could reshape the end of the war. Dubbed Die Glocke, or the Bell, it was the ultimate Wunderwaffe, or wonder weapon. Some claimed it was an anti-gravity aircraft designed to outmaneuver the Allies' fighter planes. Others claimed it was a time machine, and Hitler's intent was going to be to travel back in time and correct all of his mistakes, guaranteeing him victory. And still, other people thought Die Glocke was built from salvaged alien technology and a weapon that was truly out of this world.
What other people thought that? Okay, let's keep going.
we're gonna get rid of it. Yeah, we'll talk about it. To this day, rumors of the legendary Nazi bell still circulate. Was Hitler in possession of a miracle weapon or a source of world-altering technology? And if so, what happened to it? And who oversaw its construction? So the lore, legend, and truth of Die Glocke, the Nazi wonder weapon, will be the subject of this series. But it's not just an investigation of that alleged weapon. It's also the story of Nazi occultism. It's the story of how a movement born out of hate and junk science and fear got reinterpreted over decades into an esoteric dynasty, creating some of the most complex and powerful conspiracies in the world today. Now, I acknowledge that it will be nearly impossible to boil down all the complexities of World War II into a couple-hour podcast format, and I also acknowledge that I'm not the person to do it. I am a Fortean researcher who's fascinated by this shit. I'm not a historian, and it's even hard for historians to do that. I mean, along this journey, we're going to be talking about a bunch of crazy shit, like how some people claimed Hitler was possessed by demons and how Mussolini recovered a UFO before it was stolen by the Vatican. But I'm going to do my best to juggle all of these topics and hopefully give an overview of the war that is complex and expansive, but also full of unbelievable, crazy shit and high strangeness. And to make everything clear up front, Die Glocke was never real, at least not in its modern incarnation. This wunderwaffe is just one example of the kind of bizarre reverence conspiracy theorists have for Nazi science. They love to play up the genius of the Germans in the 30s and 40s as like these technological marvels capable of building technology that can do kind of like fucking anything.
Well, we look to things like the Volkswagen and we look to things like the machine gun, which I think that they had some military weapon breakthroughs during World War II. And for me personally, like I definitely believed for a time that Nazis were literally involved in the occult. Like I did think that that was like a thing. So, and I'm not even into that. Like I don't even care like that deeply about the occult really that much. Like that's not really my thing. So like I'm just a layperson and I totally like I see these things like in passing and I'm like, oh yeah, the Nazis were good at stuff.
I do think there's a narrative about that. I mean, it's the same type of narrative that you get about like people talking about like, well, Hitler made the trains run on time and he restarted the German economy. And like when you actually scratch the surface, like, sure. But several things, like many of these things, and we'll talk about this over and over again, I'm sure, were happening at the expense of extreme human rights abuses and extreme exploitation of some people over others. So even places where you can point to success, it wasn't done because of genius a lot of the time. It was done because people were doing things that we all agree is not okay. The Nazis did have some weaponry breakthroughs during World War II, absolutely. But like to elevate them, I think is ridiculous because at the same time, the Russians and the United States and the Allies were also having weapons breakthrough. Like it was a huge time because everybody was trying to like outpace each other. There was a lot of like smart people and money and time going into developing things that can murder us all. Woohoo! But like to isolate the Nazis as being particularly advanced, I think is just wrong because everybody was doing it and everybody was pushing forward like in great technological like leaps and bounds during that time period.
Yeah, and speaking to the economy, I think, Matt, you told me offline that actually the economy was kind of a mess.
Oh, yeah. Yeah,
and so we'll get into that, I'm sure.
We'll get into all of that. But Hitler improved commerce for a time, right? Because it was easy to have a better economy when a bunch of people left your country. And all of a sudden you had more people for more businesses and that kind of shit. Like all of these improvements, you always have to have a little caveat, a little asterisk that's like, okay, but let's go deeper and see what was actually going on. You know, what were the influential factors that did this? It's easy to say, oh, wow, everybody's employed now when you're like, also, half the people just left our country or we put them in camps.
Yeah, or we just aren't counting them. Like we told them they couldn't have their jobs anymore. We gave those jobs to other people. And then we're just like, you don't matter in terms of our employment numbers.
Exactly. Also, I just think it's hilarious that we look to the Volkswagen, and the Volkswagen is the thing that people are like, well, totally. Then, of course, the Nazis developed a flying saucer. They made a Volkswagen.
Listen,
anyway.
the chokehold that the Volkswagen bug had on everyone in the 60s and 70s, I think our modern day brains can't process.
It was like
we're like Volkswagen, that cute little car.
I know.
That we associate with love and peace.
That is so true. Oh my God, the irony.
And advancements in advertising. Anyway, that's a whole other thing. The Nazis were also good at advertising. I'm sure we'll get into that. Okay. We've gotten off track. Take us away, Matt. Take us back.
Let's focus.
So despite the rose-colored glasses that some people put on when they look at the Nazis of the 30s and 40s, it's important to remember that German scientists did create some breakthroughs, but the vast majority of their advances were hampered by their racial hygiene. Unwilling to acknowledge anything that could be remotely classified as Jewish physics, the vast majority of Nazi scientific research was stymied by racism and bigotry.
What a bunch of fucking idiots. Like, I'm sorry. As if there's a such thing as Jewish physics and like Aryan physics, as if the science changes depending on who the hell is working on it. Okay, sorry, I just had to say that.
It's going to be a thing that keeps coming up over and over again, that there's this huge separation, this line between like, no, this is good Aryan physics and that's evil Jewish physics.
They were also trying to do race science, right? Like they were doing horrible medical experiments on people, trying to prove that these differences existed, like biologically, which of course they don't. So they were spending a lot of time and money doing weird shit too.
Yeah, for no reason, based on junk science that. Anyway, we're getting
the reason
ahead.
was to prove that they were right, but they were wrong and they were never going to be right. So
yeah. This is a good moment for us all to just take a moment, and I encourage our listeners to participate in this as well. Let's just take a moment and say, fuck Nazis together, to remind everyone that sometimes evil does still exist in the world, and we don't need to tolerate that shit.
And you should, wherever you are, listeners, scream it as loud as you can.
Yeah, I encourage that. Whether if you're at home or on the train,
You're at Grand Central Station, if you're like, I don't know, wherever you are.
or in the White House Oval Office, just go ahead and
Grandma's
announce,
funeral, whatever you gotta do.
fuck Nazis.
Fuck Nazis.
fuck Nazis. Oh my God. The more I'm going to get so mad many times during this podcast. Okay.
Okay. So while this story starts in the 1930s, we are going to open it in Poland in 1997. Because that's when Polish journalist Igor Wachowski first sat down with a mysterious historian to talk about Nazi weapons. Now, Wachowski had been interested in the most esoteric aspects of Nazism for years, and his research had led him to investigate the elaborate network of underground tunnels that were in Poland. Now, this is real. That was an extensive but unfinished project called Risa, or Giant. Operation Risa was how Hitler referred to it. The intention was to move the Nazi command operations underground around the closing days of World War II. And in addition to the military heads, technology and R&D would have been relocated there too, because they realized that they had a bunch of Allied planes spying on them in the sky. You know, they were getting eyes on these industrial complexes. They were bombing industrial complexes. If the Nazis could move all of this technology and R&D underground, they could do it anonymously, hidden. According to Wachowski's research, most of these bases were used for nuclear development as the Third Reich raced to produce their own atomic bomb before the West. But one of the facilities didn't quite fit that model. And that was a base allegedly in a converted mine in Wrocław, Poland. And it had been outfitted with a massive power grid. That base was operating all the way through early 1944, even as the Russian army was marching through Poland. So this perplexed Wachowski, and he started digging into it. His research led him to the biography of Germany's Minister of Propaganda and resident asshole, Joseph Goebbels. Is that Joseph? Or is that Joseph?
And I thought it was Goebbels.
Goebbels.
Probably Joseph.
Goebbels. Joseph Goebbels.
I think you're right, Katie.
Anyway, Wachowski found a quote from Goebbels' wife written in December of 1944, and she said, Joseph had seen a new weapon so visionary that it would undoubtedly bring the wonderful victory which Hitler promised the Germans. That seemed like it was confirmation. And so he looked into some other documents that he had dug up around the time, and he found the interrogation of Otto Skorzeny, lieutenant colonel of the Waffen SS during World War II. Now, Skorzeny... Waffen?
Waffen.
Waffen. It's
Waffen.
They're V's.
Matt's doing the best he can.
I'm doing the best.
You're doing great, Matt.
You're doing really well.
I just want to spit it all out anyway.
German and Polish is
Waffen.
very hard.
Polish stunned me this morning as I was looking at some of the pronunciations of these things, and I was like, those aren't even the letters that you're using. Skorzeny was focused on unusual battle tactics on the Eastern Front. His troops would go undercover in enemy uniforms. They would destroy supply lines, hijack Red Cross hospitals and aid shipments and that kind of shit. You know the Ministry of Ungentlemanly Warfare, the British spy initiative that happened during World War II? They were the Germans' version of that.
I don't know how I've never heard of that, but a more British name has never existed.
Yeah.
Oh,
Or
Katie.
a more euphemistic name. I feel like that's John Oliver made a joke once about how the British are oh, there's a bit of a kerfuffle when there's a huge brutal battle, and I'm I feel like the Ministry of Ungentlemanly Warfare, they've ever been very gentlemanly in their warfare anyway.
Dude,
Continue.
Christopher Lee was in the Ministry of Ungentlemanly Warfare.
Wow.
There's this super famous story about how he was on the set of Lord of the Rings, and Peter Jackson tried to describe how he was supposed to get shot or get stabbed. It was how he was supposed to respond when he got stabbed, and he was like, "That's not how someone responds when they are stabbed. I will show you." And Peter Jackson was just like, "What the fuck? Okay."
People have past lives.
Yeah.
Christopher Lee had a hell of a past life.
So Witkowski found references to Skorzeny's 1944 Soderkampf, or Special Warfare. And in this, he claimed that it was going to bring the ultimate victory to the Nazis. And when Witkowski read this, it didn't seem to him like it was a battle tactic. It seemed like it was a new kind of warfare that was conducted with a yet untested weapon. This is all compounded because, and this is true, Skorzeny was arrested in 1945 and detained for 2 years before being tried for war crimes. Makes sense. But before his case could be decided, he escaped from prison and fled to Bavaria and then to Spain. There he set up an engineering business. In the 1960s, he was recruited by Mossad and enlisted to develop rockets that were used in their war against Israel. And to this day, no one really knows whether Skorzeny was working for them willingly or under the threat of death. But this is all true. That actually happened. So, to Witkowski, this is a huge alarm bell. Why would Mossad recruit this Nazi and use him to build weapons? What did he know about this?
Well, keep going. I have a thought. I have an anti-conspiracy theory thought, but
I'm done with that thread,
okay,
so
well,
please.
Here's what I would say. That's not unusual. There are Nazi scientists that came to the U.S. that we willingly welcomed in to NASA, to some of our highest institutions, because they did have training and they did have knowledge. I'll give you it's a simple one, but it's depressing. Some of the research that's gone into human space travel in terms of how humans react to cold temperatures, how humans react to high altitude, is because the Nazis were conducting medical experiments on prisoners in concentration camps by just putting them in freezing tubs of water for 5 hours, leaving them out in the cold and seeing what happened. And we willingly, in the United States, accepted that research as oh, cool. Now we have answers to these questions. Let's just keep going forward. So, like, the fact that a country recruited a Nazi scientist to, like, make weapons, I don't think that that signifies anything. It signifies he worked on advanced weaponry. He probably knew a lot about rockets. The Nazis did create some of the first, like, ballistic and cruise missiles. They didn't work very well, but they did make them. I don't think there's anything strange to it. I think the world was like, oh, look, conveniently, there's some useful scientific research here. We're just going to ignore the fact that it was made by these motherfucking assholes that we all agreed fucked everything up for like 10 years, whatever. That's what I think. I think the explanation is very simple, which is that he actually did have scientific knowledge and everyone just decided to ignore the fact that he was a shit.
I think it's fascinating, though, Katie, because you brought up Operation Paperclip, where the Nazis were recruited and brought into American military and scientific advancement. And Operation Paperclip is, of course, one of the many, many threads that lead us down conspiracy theory tracks, where we're talking like, oh, yeah, and then the Nazi scientists went to work on the Philadelphia experiment, and then the Philadelphia experiment snowballed into Montauk, and then, you know, Montauk is also connected to Area 51 and all of this shit. Paperclip was real. Like, we actually did that. We brought the Nazi scientists in, we used their knowledge, and we even used them kind of for some of the MK Ultra shit and the mind experiments that the CIA was doing in the 60s. But that then gets perverted into more of this conspiracy theory stuff that we're going to talk about over and over in this episode.
I think that it adds to the idea of the Nazi genius, the flawless scientific mind. It feeds that conspiracy.
Right. This idea that, oh my God, what were they developing over there? It must have been so important, so powerful that we sought them out and brought them here, right?
And what else don't we know about it?
Exactly.
The flip side to me is that capitalism and power, making money and being on top, like technologically and militarily, is more important than human rights. Like, especially after World War II, for extremely good reason. People were horrified about what had happened. And we made all of these global human rights laws and things like that. But like, at the end of the day, we still see this today. The first fucking thing to go when you're trying to get to an agreement, when you're trying to make treaties, when you're at like one of these global conferences, the first fucking thing to go is human rights. Always, 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 always. Like, yeah, what don't we know? I think what don't we know is our inability to admit that people decide they don't fucking care, that people are bad people if they have information that other people think is useful to gain money or power or technological advancement. I just think like that's people want to fuel conspiracy theories because I think sometimes it's hard to believe like, well, these people were ostracized and like, why would we welcome them in? What the information they had must have been so good for us to forgive them for what they did. Or people just decided they didn't care that much.
Yeah.
Yeah. So all of this line of research connected Witkowski to this unnamed historian. In his book, The Truth About the Wunderwaffe, Witkowski refuses to divulge the name or the details of this source, but says that they had, quote, access to many interesting documents of an intelligence nature and relating to the Third Reich. And this is one of the things we're going to see over and over again. It's always, I'm not the source of this information. It's never somebody that you can cross-reference. It's always going to be, I knew this guy. I can't tell you who he is, but he knows everything that the Nazis were doing in those underground bases.
The alarm bell should be going off when things like that happen.
It should. And I understand, like, sometimes you need anonymous sources. Like, sometimes that's important for journalism. But there's a huge difference between that anonymous source and this anonymous source that's like, yeah, the Nazis had a fucking flying saucer down there.
Yeah, I feel like it's almost the exact same thing that we talked about. Doc, oh my God, I'm blanking on his
Doc
name.
Shields.
Doc Shields, like Doc Shields or the other guy, like where they say like, oh, people are just bringing this information to me. I can't really verify it or anything like that. Like it's the same fucking thing.
So during their meeting, their first meeting, the historian asked Wachowski, point blank, have you ever encountered Die Glocke in your research? Wachowski said, no, I haven't. And the historian took a napkin and drew a sketch of a very conventional-looking bell. Except this, he explained, was the key to a failed Nazi plot at world domination. Whatever it was the source of a great and terrible power, one the Reich was on the brink of completing before they had been defeated in 1945. That's why Mossad wanted Skorzeny, because he knew the secret behind the most advanced weapon in history. And so that piqued Wachowski's interest. So if the Nazis were developing some type of high-tech weapon, what was it? And more importantly, what happened to it after the war? If they were right on the brink, if they were just about to be there, what happened and why were no historians talking about it? What were we missing?
I'm just so curious though, like when everyone's like, oh, the greatest weapon in war, like we know what that is. It's the nuclear bomb. We have it. We're the only ones who fucking used it. So like we could go down that path too. What are the other ones? Like I'm just thinking like we're pretty okay, people could have been thinking these things in the 50s, the 60s when we're still like advancing technologically. We're like a lot further along now, right? So thinking about what we do know now, let's go through the list of things that this weapon could have been, right? Okay, there's chemical weapons, mustard gas. Okay, maybe some other type of gas or something like that. We already have those, but okay. Nuclear power, we know what that does. A bell, that's making me think like sound weapons or something like that, because we have those like sound things that clear crowds now, that like where the sound like stays in the column or whatever.
It's the bell, to be clear. It's the bell because of the shape, not what the weapon did.
I know, but it just like triggered it in my head.
Okay.
So I'm like,
Yeah,
okay,
sure.
was it some kind of sound weapon? There was a lot of electricity, you say, in the thing. Was it some kind of electronic, like using electricity, like putting a taser? I don't know. Like, okay, so those are the four things. Like, I'm trying to think of like what other. I'm sure there's way more conspiracy out there, but I'm trying to take it down the path of logic, which no one ever does in conspiracy theory land. But it's just like, if it's like this great unknown technology, unless you immediately go to like outer space shit, there's sort of a limited range, right? Like of, okay, even if they really were like on the precipice of developing this insane new weapon that didn't exist in 1945, what could it have been? There's not that many things.
Well, I think what you're missing, and
Okay,
now
tell me.
the conspiracy theories would say that it's either an anti-gravity weapon, a time machine, or a UFO. But
Cool. Okay.
but leaving all that aside, I think the thread that you're missing here is that the conspiracy theorists, the people who believe in this Die Glocke mystery, would claim that it has always been off the books. So those are the things that you know about because they're public. But basically the narrative here is that since 1945, all the development on this has been completely black budget, off book in these secret governmental programs that only like 10 people know about. And it's been that way for the last 70 years. You're making this face like that's total bullshit. And I agree. But
No, it's just because it's the same fucking thing we talk about. People are not that good at keeping secrets. I also 1000% disagree that something that scientifically and technologically advanced, that there would only be 10 people that knew about it. You need a lot more people working on a project like that.
But here's the thing. Here's the thing, and this is jumping kind of way ahead, but it's important because I think it's thematic for what we're talking about. If you buy this, or if you can convince someone of this, you're convincing them, okay, there is massive technology that has been kept from you for decades. Think about the problems that we have today, like climate change, like farming issues, like population growth, that kind of stuff. How much of that could be helped, could be mitigated, could be fixed with this technology that is being completely hidden from the public? And that then becomes this anti-government conspiracy, and it drives people to, it gets you worked up, it makes you think, oh my God, I can't believe the government would be hiding something so important from us. Why would they do this?
Well, it sows massive distrust.
Absolutely.
And it creates radical thinking.
It upends, right? It upends the way that people think, and it does create governmental distrust, or at least institutional distrust, right? So that's why when we talk about like what could this weapon possibly be, we don't know because they never let us know. But to understand why it's so ridiculous that the Nazis were developing futuristic military tech in the 1940s, let's talk about German science in the days leading up to the war and the end of the war. Okay. When the Nazis came to power in 1933, they almost immediately began to implement policies designed to instill racial hygiene. The 1933 law for the prevention of hereditarily diseased offspring required involuntary sterilization of people with a range of conditions deemed to be inferior. And those were things like mental deficiency, schizophrenia, epilepsy, Huntington's chorea, and people who were deaf and blind hereditarily. It also mandated sterilization of what they called the Rhineland bastards, which were mixed-race children of African and German descent. This was the beginning of all of this. The Nazis' campaign against non-Aryans continued with the enaction of the Nuremberg laws, which strove to preserve pure German bloodlines. These banned marriages between Germans and what were considered inferior races, Jews, Slavs, Romani, and Black people. The entire process drove not only a legal wedge between races, but a cultural one, too. And so the Nazi government effectively painted non-Aryans as a completely different type of person, depicting them as genetically inferior, dirty, and dangerous.
Would this be around the time that people would start leaving Germany? I would imagine that there was probably a big exodus after that.
Yeah. Basically, as soon as the Nazis, and it was once the Nazis came into power, immediately they started fast-tracking these laws, and people started to flee.
Yeah. There's a little anecdote in like how quickly they were trying to enact these things. Like pretty soon after the Nazis came to power, I think it was like January 33 or something like that. I forget exactly. In March or April, Hitler tried to do like a day where you boycotted all Jewish businesses and you weren't allowed to shop at Jewish businesses on that day. But to show you how you have to indoctrinate people a little bit more, and also to show you how these things happen, right? Like they happen more slowly at first. Basically, when that happened, people were like, who is this lunatic? Like, and people literally saved their shopping till the day and went to their friends and neighbors and colleagues' Jewish businesses that they always shopped at, and specifically saved their shopping to the day that they were supposed to boycott the businesses because they were like, this Looney Tunes guy, like, this is ridiculous. And so in 1933, early 1933, just a couple of months after he came to power, he tried to do something really extreme to the Jewish people, like right away. And everybody in Germany was like, no, like, what's wrong with you? And they fought it, but then...
Well, we know what happened then, right?
And we know what happened. But I'm just saying, like, it just goes to show, like, how soon, like, to Matt's point, like, how soon he immediately started enacting things like this. And, like, not everyone cared or obeyed right away. Mm-hmm. But, yeah, it was immediate.
It's really interesting that the parallel of the German people calling, like, thinking that he's crazy and, like, doing these counter acts. and how I see some very deep parallels to what's happening today in our country. Like it's crazy when you say things like that. Like also cutting off rights to disabled people and otherwise. And I see so much of that playing out. I think that Trump recently did something about he no longer wanted there to be like a deaf interpreter in something. It might have been the White House.
Literally 3 days ago, the National Association of the Deaf filed a lawsuit because there was not an ASL translator at the press briefings, White House press briefings. Yeah.
And I mean, it's atrocious to me that he did that. And I know these things might seem small, but to what Katie said, I think these things happen in these small isolated events, and then it just starts to really snowball into all these terrible things. Like we're seeing people get picked up out of nowhere by ICE and sent away for no fucking reason. And it's like, I think to me, these parallels are so starkly obvious that it's frightening to hear about this stuff.
No, I mean that it was one of the reasons when I sat down to plan out how I was going to structure the series this year, that I thought that this would be a very important series for us to talk about. So all of this Nazi racial hygiene was vaguely based on the theory of eugenics and the ramblings of Darwin's half-cousin. Seriously. So after Darwin visited Africa, he published The Origin of the Species, which was the first book to outline the theory of evolution. Reading this inspired his half-cousin, Francis Galton, an academic aristocrat with way, way, way too much time on his hands. Galton was obsessed with this idea of classification, that you could understand the universe around you by breaking it into tiny little boxes. That was a widely popular approach to science during the 19th century, where we were building taxonomy, so scientific classifications. That's, kingdom, phylum, species, all that good stuff. This drove scientists to question the existence of God, which was reinforced by Darwin's idea that species could evolve on their own biologically. And then you end up with these two compounding ideas. Species have the ability to essentially improve themselves over time without needing the guiding hand of a deity. And then we can take all of that and break it into neat little classifications with distinct lines separating them. In Darwin's example, your finches, some of these evolved sharper beaks to pierce fruit. So they were able to thrive better because they altered their lineage into a more advanced one. But if you take a macro look at that, you could almost say that finches unknowingly biologically altered themselves to be a superior species. That's exactly what Galton thought anyway. There's this idea that there's this theoretical superiority that can be achieved in a species through targeted evolutionary changes. Darwin's finches had done it involuntarily, or at least without intending to do so. But what if a species or a race decided to specifically change itself through genetics with the intention of becoming a better, stronger organism? This is the theory of eugenics. A concept here was that there was kind of a perfect state of existence that we could ultimately achieve through selective breeding and pruning out the undesirable elements from a species. If the theory of evolution is correct, then an intelligent species like humans could ultimately reshape their own species into a more perfect organism, like the xenomorph.
That is the ultimate being.
That's what they say. That's in Alien. That's what Ash says. It's the perfect organism.
I would say so, except, I don't know. It did get blasted out into the outer space by a woman in a what was that thing called? What was that?
Power loader?
Power loader. Thank you.
I think that just goes to show that a woman in a power loader is the ultimate species.
Yes, she proved it.
That is true evolution.
Yes.
Evolutionary superiority.
Oh my gosh. I think I just don't believe in evolutionary superiority. I believe in evolution, but it's like the environment's always changing. So how are you going to create like an ultimate creature?
It's a flawed idea.
Hold that thought.
Yeah.
You're suitable to your environment. You're not superior.
Yeah.
Okay.
Hold that thought, because we'll talk about that in a
Yeah.
second. But first, let's talk about Galton and why he thought that this was so fucking awesome. Because he was sitting essentially in his like drawing room thinking about this stuff. And I think a little bit jealous that his cousin was the one who published and he didn't. But he had this very like simplistic worldview. He relied on this idea that everything had a classification and there were superior and inferior versions of everything. He believed that so strongly that one of his lifelong quests was brewing the perfect cup of tea. And he claimed in an 1872 paper on tea-making theory that the ideal cup of tea was brewed at 180 to 190 degrees Fahrenheit for 8 minutes, and the tea was held in a muslin tea bag that was discarded after every use.
I don't mean to throw the tea bag out with the bathwater, but I would try this, except I really don't believe anything he has to say, so...
Beauty is in the eye of the beholder, and the perfect cup of tea is a subjective thing based on a person's tastes, not on scientific objectivity.
The Art of Tea says that black tea should be steeped at 200 to 212 degrees for 3 to 5 minutes. But you're right, Katie. There is no right or wrong answer. It's personal fucking preference.
Right.
And the fact that Galton obsessed so much over this, going so far as to write a fucking research paper on it, goes to show how narrow his worldview was and how little he had to do every day.
Yeah, how much time he had.
You have to imagine this fucking guy just brewing tea after tea after tea, being like, check, 7.5 minutes. Not quite right.
There's a world in which I respect the effort, right? So, for example, Ina Garten, love her. She has talked about her process for making recipes. And, you know, the way you get a really good recipe is you make the same thing over and over and over and over again till you get it exactly right so that you can write it down and produce reliably the same thing every time, right? And like, arguably, that's what he's doing with the tea, right? He's like, here's how I like my tea. What do I have to do to know that it's going to turn out the same every time? Cool. But that's for you, dude. That's like not because that tea is superior to all other tea. If you don't like the cake that comes out of Ina Garten's cake recipe, it doesn't make you flawed. You just like use a different recipe. Like, I don't know.
Also, importantly, Ina Garten didn't go on to write fucking research papers on eugenics.
No, Ina Garten doesn't even claim that her recipes are the best. She just says they're ooey gooey and yummy. So she just claims that her recipes will get you the same thing every time and that they're delicious. That's all she's claiming.
Right. Galton didn't understand evolution, and he wasn't a scientist. He was an armchair anthropologist with too much time on his hands and a half-cousin who was way more renowned than he was. Galton misunderstood how evolution worked and wrote misguided papers on a bullshit theory, that's eugenics, that set science back decades and was indirectly responsible for one of the most evil enterprises in the last 200 years.
That's so sad. His cousin helped science, brought science ahead by decades, and this guy brought it back. It's just like...
It's terrible.
Man.
100%. He's a lot to blame in, you know, writing research papers on eugenics. But I don't want to, like, let everyone else who was, like, already racist off the hook because they were like, oh, look, now we have science to justify the fact that we're just like fucking assholes who like think we're better than other people.
The burgeoning theory of eugenics dovetailed really nicely with the Enlightenment ideas of the previous century. And the same idea that founded America. people can control their own destiny. They don't need a creator. They don't need a king to tell them what to do. And early eugenicists then piggybacked on both of these concepts and claimed that we could go beyond a cultural revolution and actually have an evolutionary revolution as well. An evolution revolution. And eugenics was then the evolution revolution solution.
Are you making these phrases up, Matt?
Oh, yeah.
I'm so proud.
Very good.
But there's a huge problem. There's a huge problem. Because evolution isn't questing for perfection. That's a misunderstanding of what it is. It's happening because traits are selected inside certain parameters, regardless of their actual effectiveness or idealism. Sometimes it's necessary in a specific environment, even if that's not objectively superior. Take cave animals, like bats and cave fish. They're living in this continual darkness, and their eyes actually mutate to become less functional because they're unnecessary for the animal's survival in that environment. There's actually a name for that. We call it regressive evolution, where a trait regresses in efficacy due to environmental pressure. Does that adapt the animals to better suit their environment? Sure, but I don't know if you can say that evolution has made them genetically superior to other fish or mammals that actually have eyesight and use it. And sometimes that'll happen even if it's not optimal. Take the island of Pingilap, an atoll in Micronesia. Have either of you ever heard of this place?
No.
This is a fascinating little piece of evolutionary theory. During the 1700s, a typhoon wiped out nearly everybody living there. Few remaining people started to interbreed through necessity, and they cultivated specific traits. On that island, there's a 10% chance that someone will be born with a specific type of color blindness. And over 30% of the population is carrying the genes for achromatopsia. But elsewhere in the world, those color blindness rates are about 1 in every 30,000, or about 0.0033%, as opposed to 10% on that island.
That's fascinating.
Yeah, and I mean, I don't think you'd ever say that color blindness is genetic perfection, but it happened because small populations cultivated traits because the breeding pool was so tiny. That's evolution.
Does it help them in some way?
No, it doesn't help them at all.
Okay. I was just thinking, like, I don't know. I started thinking of it as like some kind of like sunglasses. Like, I don't know. That doesn't, of course, that's not how it works at all. UV still affects people with color blindness. Anyway.
Yeah.
Right.
But I think I see where Katie's going. I think where it's just like the bats lost their eyesight to help them in caves. And this was almost like a different example, but still an example of genetic selection where a certain trait just continues on because of the breeding population.
Yeah.
Also, would eugenicists say that we shouldn't have giant pandas because they only eat bamboo and they need 17,000 tons of it to like survive? That's not the most efficient thing, but look at giant pandas.
Yeah.
They're so cute. They bring so much to the world. Mm-hmm. And I don't know if this is true. I'm completely making this up, but I was thinking about the fact that bamboo is like incredibly fast growing. It grows really quickly. Mm-hmm. And so like maybe giant pandas need to eat a lot of bamboo because they were keeping the bamboo population in check when there was like more of them. I don't know.
I think sometimes, and I want to make this really clear, sometimes we take too simplistic of a view of evolution as well, because I suspect a biologist would tell you that what actually happened is giant pandas, as they grew in size, required more bamboo. Because they put pressures on the bamboo started growing faster. And then the giant pandas were capable of eating more of it, and it becomes this symbiotic relationship.
Yeah. Or, I mean, evolution happens so slowly over time. Like, we might be seeing something that's left over from some other environmental thing that hasn't, like, quite swapped out yet. I don't know. Do you know what I mean? Like,
Yeah.
it's not like these things are happening in perfect sync. Like, they're playing off of each other.
They might be unrelated. It is that age-old question of what came first, the bamboo or the panda. We just don't know.
I'm just saying that the panda evolved to eat bamboo because bamboo was there. That doesn't necessarily mean that eating bamboo is the ideal for the panda. It's just that the panda was there and the bamboo was there, so it evolved to eat the bamboo. Evolution is not always... there's not always a reason for evolution. Sometimes it's just because things exist together. That's why you get this island with a population of colorblind people.
Right, which is why evolution is not about superiority. It's
Exactly.
not happening with like an
Yes.
ultimate reason in mind. It's not headed toward anything. It's just heading.
Yes, exactly. It doesn't make things perfect. It just makes things survive and survive within the bottlenecks that they exist. Theoretically, you could breed an entire race of Aryan people, but you're also limiting the gene pool of those people, and you're more likely to replicate genetic flaws during that process.
Look at the royals of Europe.
Exactly,
Oh, yes.
right? Yeah.
Examples A, B, C, and D.
Now, not understanding any of this because of his simplistic worldview, Francis Galton published his eugenics theory in the late 19th century and went on to become president of the Eugenics Education Society. The theory then quickly got perverted as it hit political circles. And soon, the concept of racial superiority came to the table, alongside the idea that inferior races were sandbagging the process of humanity. And, unremarkably, those inferior races were always the kinds of people that aristocratic whites hated and feared: Jews and people of color. This drove a bunch of people into self-exodus, with many Jewish scientists and thinkers fleeing Nazi-occupied countries. Einstein himself fled Germany in 1933, the same year Hitler was elected. Despite all of this, bringing us back to Germany, a German chemist, Dr. Otto Hahn, discovered nuclear fission. Working at Kaiser Wilhelm, I guess that's Wilhelm, isn't it? Working at Kaiser Wilhelm Institute, Hahn and his team first split the atom, creating a chain of continual splits and the release of a massive amount of explosive energy, the prototype for a nuclear bomb. Now, it's important to point out that Hahn was working closely with Fritz Strassmann and Lise Meitner. The latter would later be called the German Marie Curie by Einstein, although her contributions to chemistry and nuclear physics go largely unacknowledged. In 1944, Otto Hahn was rewarded the Nobel Prize for his research, with Strassmann as a collaborator, and Meitner was left out altogether. She would go on to refine her research with Niels Bohr. This discovery of fission set off its own chain reaction, with scientists all over the world scrambling to develop their own tiny little nuclear reactions. The idea of weaponizing such a devastating effect was on everybody's mind. By 1941, the United States had recruited Robert J. Oppenheimer into the Manhattan Project, where the first atomic bomb was successfully tested, and we all know how that story ends. Oppenheimer himself was something of an occultist and a mystic, having studied Hindu texts alongside his chemistry and physics. After the bomb test, he famously quoted from the Bhagavad Gita and said, "If the radiance of 1,000 suns were to burst at once into the sky, that would be like the splendor of the Mighty One. Now I am become death, shatterer of worlds."
There was something so profoundly terrifying about somebody who just like created that bomb and then is quoting a text like that, saying that they have become a destroyer of worlds. It's just like, I appreciate that Oppenheimer understood the gravity of the situation, but it's just a very frightening quote to me.
Yeah. I mean, I don't I don't know. So, listeners, correct me if I'm wrong. And I have yet to see Oppenheimer, the movie.
Me too.
But I should. But I always understood that he quoted it solemnly. It wasn't that he was proud of it. He was more of just fuck, I did this.
That's exactly what it was.
Now
Yes.
it exists.
Yep.
And yeah.
No, but that's it. The solemnness scares me. The solemnness is what is so chilling to me, is that he deeply understood that.
I think it was his realization that this is out now. There is no going back. He knew that the world had changed forever with that reaction.
One of my friends in grad school was at the University of Nevada, Reno. And I guess Oppenheimer spent some time there during his work. And he checked out a book. And in the library card, one of the people several back was Oppenheimer.
Wow. What was the book?
I forget. I'll have to hunt it down. I have the picture somewhere.
That would be important to know. I wonder what it was.
It was a history book. It wasn't. I don't think it was some science.
Wasn't
book,
a smutty beach read or something?
No. It was an academic book. Okay. I'll
Pride
find
and
it though,
Prejudice.
and I'll find it.
So while all that was going on, we had a war in Europe. Germany invaded Poland in 1939 and pushed west into France in 1940. Italy invaded Greece. German fighters dropped bombs on Britain. These were the same bombings that a young Doc Shields hid from during his early life. By 1940, Hungary, Romania, Slovakia had joined Hitler as well. Working together with his other group of assholes, Heinrich Himmler and Reinhard Heydrich, Hitler instituted a plan of mass deportation and extermination, a, quote, final solution for the, quote, Jewish question. This language, the Jewish question, had been used for almost a century and referred to the unbearably racist philosophical debate, what do we do about the Jews? In a more nuanced sense, it questioned the status of legions of Jews, many of whom had no country to call their own. In a less nuanced sense, it was an inflammatory piece of racist rhetoric, which, again, basically posed the question, is there anything we can do about these people that I don't like? This was largely the result of the emancipation of the Jewish population after the French Revolution. So throughout the 19th century, Europe began to recognize Jewish people as contributing members of society and started to integrate them in business and education. So what happened is you had a population of Jews who had previously been living in poverty and now were suddenly wealthy and educated, or at least not poor. Throughout the end of the 19th century, you saw a lot of Jewish businesses starting to open in Europe. You saw a lot of these people become successful, and they were kind of, to your average German person, they were like rags to riches stories. It felt unfair. It also prompted them to start businesses and entrepreneurial endeavors, which reshaped the landscape for their people. But this rapid rise gets met with backlash because you start to see these Jews as greedy immigrants, undeserving of the success. You think that they're coming in and undermining you in your country. And that made them the perfect scapegoats and talking points for Hitler and the Nazis. And so by 1940, Hitler's final solution for the problem that had been, quote, plaguing his country for the last century was to round them up, put them in camps, and exterminate them. And with that, the Holocaust was born.
I see so many parallels to that today with the idea of this is an old theory, but the Great Replacement crap and believing that white people are, I don't know. It's just, I see that here in this country happening right now with many, many people coming in. Immigrants are bad. We must round them up. We must get rid of them. This is just happening all over again, I think.
Yeah, I mean, also one of the reasons that the sort of narratives about Jewish people, the racism that already existed toward Jewish people was so useful to Hitler is because after the First World War, Germany was just devastated. The Treaty of Versailles, the economic and military sort of like parameters that were put on Germany after the First World War were devastating to their economy. Like the Weimar Republic, there was like rampant inflation, like people were very poor. Hitler used Jewish people to explain why this was happening to Germany rather than to, you know, tell the truth, which is that they had lost another war, and there were like large global economic ramifications for that. And like, I feel like, to your point, EJ, there's a lot of that going on now. Like, there are larger forces at play that are causing problems amongst people, right? Like extreme wealth inequality.
Yes.
A lack of a social safety net, a lack of education, lack of opportunity. All of those economic circumstances or all these different situations, like it's much easier to blame that on immigrants or people that don't look like you or people whose lives are different than yours than it is to address huge problems that will take years to fix, even if we start massive overhauls right now. And on top of that, like my own little, I don't even think it's a conspiracy theory. People in power don't want to fix those things because if they fix those things, it lessens their power. I personally believe the pie is big enough for everyone, but you know, I don't, like a lot of times people in power feel like if they shift things, that what that will change for them is something that they don't want to give up, right? So it's easier to blame it on other people or turn away, look away, like if that doesn't match your values or whatever. So I think it's just a lot of things. And like to your point, Matt, you know, Hitler found it very convenient to blame Jewish people. And I also think he himself was like obviously incredibly racist. So it wasn't just a useful scapegoat.
Yeah, I mean, it served a lot of. It was very, very useful for him because he was racist. He did believe in this German superiority. He believed in this whole idea that they could create this superior race, even though he was like this fucking weenie little guy. Like, yeah,
It's about like selling. What can you sell faster to a population? It's what talking points are more incendiary and can get you riled up, especially a population that's currently on its knees. You know, where their dollar had no value and everything was a mess. And you know, you can create problems that don't exist in front of a people and get them to do whatever you want them to do. If your message is clear and your message hits at their pain points easily enough, you can turn a population to what you need them to do. And I think we're seeing that here, and I think it definitely happened there.
There is a ton more that we can say about all of this, but the important point here is that the Nazi government created a problem for themselves. I'm not talking about the Jewish problem that they had. I'm talking about the fact that they had for years been espousing the evils of non-Aryans. But now they've entered a war with basically everybody else in the world. And in less than a decade, Hitler's Germany had become a nation built on warfare. And that requires two things. One, it requires a robust and extensive group of contractors, scientists, and engineers, people who are going to push innovation, build your weapons of war. And two, it requires a massive influx of capital into your war machine to fund these operations. War is fucking expensive. And guess what? The Nazis had neither. As we discussed, many of the non-Aryan scientists and engineers like Einstein fled the country. Otto Hahn, the guy who split the atom, was a very outspoken opponent of Nazism, and his partner, Lisa Meitner, was forced to flee the country. On top of this deficit, the very tenets of Nazism forbid using innovations and research from lesser people, like the Jews. And the regime had banned any trade unions that existed before their rise of power, effectively locking out a massive chunk of commerce, because they're certainly not going to take money from any Jewish businesses, right? You can't do that and then also fund eugenics.
They took lots of money from Jewish businesses and people. Let's just be
They did it their own way.
very clear.
Well,
They did it another way. Yeah.
They stole their money.
That is what they were doing. Yes, absolutely. But they weren't, they weren't forming trade unions with other nations. You can't do that. You're at war with all of these people. So the Nazis are left with an uphill climb, both monetarily and militarily. Their stubborn refusal to accept any scientific advancement from non-Aryans put Nazi science on the back foot from day one. In fact, Niels Bohr fled to the US from Denmark just days before he was arrested. He had been helping people escape, refugees. He'd been helping refugees escape out of Germany, including atom splitter Lise Meitner. And he would go on to consult on the Manhattan Project, the atomic bomb that would ultimately be the end of World War II. So because of the Nazis' oppression, they lost that thinker. And he's just one of hundreds and thousands of them. Now, that doesn't mean that the Nazi engineers were incapable of building weapons. We had panzer tanks, legendary war machines, serving all the theaters of war. They also developed early cruise missiles, which were, here we go, the Tungswaffen. The Tungswaffen 1 and 2. Those were essentially long-range ballistic missiles.
I think they were called, I think in English it means like vengeance weapon 1 and 2. Yeah.
Yeah, vengeance weapons. Mm-hmm. We call them the V1 and V2 rockets.
Oh, okay.
Yeah. I was reading about those this morning from the Air and Space Museum, because the Air and Space Museum, the one in Virginia, has a lot of some of the Nazi weapons from the end of World War II. It has some of their most advanced planes and their missiles. And they were saying the V1, they fired a lot of those. The V2 was like extremely inaccurate, and it would often like break mid-flight. So like these missiles were, let's be fair, like the beginning of technology that we use today, but they were not perfect by any stretch of the imagination. And like the Allied forces quickly figured out how to like deter them. Also,
I read that more money was poured into the development of the V1 and V2 rockets than the entire Manhattan Project.
Oh, wow.
If you want to talk about like getting the most efficiency and result out of your money, that's kind of a shitty ROI.
The V1, they made a lot of them, and they fired this Air and Space Smithsonian article was saying they fired a lot of them, like 33,000 or something of the V1. But the V2, they didn't fire very many of them because they were so expensive to make. They were devastating. If they hit, they produced like these huge explosions and massive craters, but they were extremely inaccurate. And again, they would often like break in flight. And so like they were only useful if you were just like sending them to a general urban area, because like they had no idea where they were going to land.
The Nazis were developing their own nuclear bomb too. Concurrently with the Allies' Manhattan Project, Germany was developing Uranverein, or the Uranium Club. However, this program was also plagued with difficulties, just like the V2s. Understaffed, unable to use any science but Aryan science, right? Disorganized. The Uranium Club hit a series of snags during its development. Albert Speer, the Minister of Armaments and War Production, was so embarrassed by the lack of output that he downplayed the efficacy of an atomic bomb to Hitler. He went to Hitler and was like, "Don't worry about that. It's not going to be anything."
Not to get conspiracy theorist on this, but I do know that it is a thing where in times of war like this, many people who claim to be scientists toward that cause do kind of a slow, they do like a slow resistance. So basically, undermining as much as they can, quiet quitting, fucking up. It's basically very quiet sabotage. I just wonder how much of that played into some of this failure.
I have read debates over whether that was Speer's intention.
Really?
Yes. Yeah.
Okay. Because I would do that. I would go to Hitler and be like, yeah, the atomic bomb just ain't what you think it is. You know, I would downplay the efficacy of many good weapons.
I also think as part of this like narrative that the Nazis were so efficient, they were so together because of like we do have evidence, for example, that they kept like meticulous records of certain things. Like there are pieces of evidence that show that like they were efficient and good at operational processes in certain ways. But then I think it's like what you're saying, Matt, like there are these other ways where they were completely a mess, just a mess. And I think one of the things that often gets overlooked and has like sort of come up recently, because there was that article like right before the election that Trump said that he wanted the kind of Hitler generals that Hitler had. And like people were like, you know, Hitler's generals tried to kill him, right? Like they tried to assassinate him. Because they did. And I think that like there's this, I think just more broadly in the idea of like fascism, of authoritarianism, of dictators taking over. Like there's this narrative that surrounds them that they were invincible, and they are not, like by any stretch of the imagination. If you wanted to argue about successful dictators, I mean, there's lots of them in the world's history, but like you could say in the 20th century that Hitler was successful for a while toward his own goals. We'll eliminate a lot of other goals or whatever. Toward his own goals, he retained power. He got to start implementing his bullshit racism, right? But it was a mess. People didn't like it. It wasn't efficient. It wasn't good. People were fighting back the whole time, whether or not they changed the course of history, which they didn't. Obviously, they tried to assassinate him. It didn't work out. But like, I think that we need to remember that when you start to hear these narratives, particularly about Nazi Germany and about Hitler, about how they were so great and so efficient and so genius, so smart, like what a leader. No, it's not true. It's just not true.
No, I mean, he drove his country toward bankruptcy. We'll talk about that in just a minute.
Yeah.
And yeah, I mean, he retained power, except for the fact that he saw Mussolini get hanged and was like, fuck, I don't want that to happen to me. And so he shot himself in the head. You know? So yeah, he retained power, I guess. But in a couple of days, he was fucked.
Right. And that's what I want to say. Like when I say successful, I don't know by what measure you would say that, honestly. Yeah. Right. Because like it all fell apart. But if you want to say that like, okay, he managed to get into power and retain power for slightly over a decade under incredibly traumatic circumstances. Sure. You know, like where he royally fucked everything up.
Yeah. The Uranium Club was hindered even further when a small regiment of Norwegian commandos raided and sabotaged a heavy water plant in Vermork, Norway. Called Operation Gunnerside, this act set Germany's nuclear program back indefinitely and is likely one of the most important events of the entire war. The leader of the raid, Joachim Roneberg, later said, if the mission had failed, London could have looked like Hiroshima.
Oh my God.
Yeah.
Did they think that they were that close to getting an atomic bomb?
They were getting there. Yeah. Yeah. They might have been successful given enough time. Yeah. Historians tend to point to Gunnerside as being the thing that ultimately made Hitler consider that it was too complex and too difficult to pursue atomic bombs. So if they had enough time, maybe, yeah. But thanks to these failures, Hitler continued to pour his money into his proven weapons: missiles, tanks, planes. Nuclear was forgotten, but it did goad the Allies to build their own atomic bomb, which ultimately proved to be the turning point of the war. So that all gets to a second problem, though, which is money. Wars, as we've said, are really, really fucking expensive. And once again, a huge sector of German businesses had been gutted because they'd been run by non-Aryans and people who didn't support the Nazi Party. So now you have a country that needs gobs of capital, but only wants to get it from several very select people. Luckily for them, the Nazis, can plunder and invade countries and take all of their wealth, which they did in copious amounts. But you can't just invade a country, steal their money and valuables, imprison their population camps, and say, everything's going to be all right. By 1942, the Nazis were facing major insurgencies in all of their occupied territories, plus continual attacks by the Allies, including the newly recruited Americans. By this point, the German economy was basically just fueling the war. Restaurants were closed. There was nothing. You walk down the street, everything was boarded up. Everything was converted to make bullets, armaments, weapons.
That looked like a country that's headed for a loss, a war machine that's going to fail.
Yeah, when you get to that point, because I feel like I even think about like France and Britain, right, who were devastated by the war, rationing, intense rationing, even well into the early 50s, Britain was still rationing because of the war. But they still had restaurants. They still had some semblance of like civil society, you know?
Doc Shields was going to magic shows. You know, like these things existed. And they had like entertainment for the troops and stuff. Germany had nothing. So the greater point here that I've spent 7 pages getting to is that the Nazis weren't exactly a military powerhouse by 1940. They'd lost a gigantic chunk of their scientists through voluntary and compulsive expulsion. They were rapidly running out of money to fund all aspects of the war. And after atomic failure through Operation Gunnerside, the last thing on Hitler's mind was sinking more time and more Reichsmarks into potential failures. So, think about that in terms of Die Glocke. Think about that in terms of developing a new weapon that nobody's ever seen before. Is that really the psychological place of Hitler and the German elite? Is that where you're going to spend your time and your money, or are you going to make the things, spend your money on making the things that you know are sure bets because the Allies are knocking on the door, right? But if what Igor Witkowski and his historian contact believed were true, the Nazis were closer to turning the tide than anybody realized. In a race against time, Hitler allegedly launched into plans to build an underground military base where final development could begin on the weapon that would ultimately turn the tide of the war. But we will talk about that base and the inevitable fall of the Third Reich in our next episode.
All right. I mean, he was Looney Tunes. That's the other thing that people like, because this man was nuts. He was totally insane. He was a megalomaniac.
Yeah.
Next episode, we're going to get into Hitler.
Oh.
We're going to talk about the things that Hitler got wrong.
Such a fucking weirdo.
Yeah.
Cool.
Also, I'm sorry. what a pussy, man. Like, you enacted all of these policies. You had all of this stance, and you stood in front of all of those people claiming to be such a strong leader, and then in the end, you wouldn't even have the courage of your convictions to go on trial and continue to stand up for what you believed in. You hid away in your little bunker and you shot yourself. Fuck you.
None of these people have the courage of their convictions, because that's not like... A courage of your conviction is like, I think it's believing in like, I don't know, like moral truth, in like something bigger than yourself. He didn't believe in something bigger than himself. He believed himself and people he decided he liked were better than everybody else. That's like very different, I think, as a motivating factor.
Yeah. What can serve Hitler?
But yeah, so that's your introduction to Die Glocke. That is your background, the condensed slaying monsters background of World War II. Now you know everything you need to know about World War II.
Is that right?
No, not at all. Not at all. No, we're going to talk, because we're going to get into Hitler and Hitler's viewpoints in the next episode. And then we're going to start to talk about the underground bases, and then we'll talk about some of the things that Die Glocke could have been or could not have been.
The conspiracy theories.
The conspiracy theory, yeah. Yeah, but the major takeaway here is everybody likes to claim that the Germans were these technological wonderkins, and they were going to like reshape the war, and Die Glocke was some massive technology advancement that they had, but they couldn't develop a nuclear bomb. They kept fucking up their V2 rockets. These were not the people to invent something out of thin air that nobody had ever seen before.
And I do think a lot of this was not a lot of it, but I do think that there were some people in there sabotaging.
Mm-hmm. Oh, I'm sure.
Played a huge role in this.
I don't know for certain in my research, but like like in terms of higher levels of government, but like absolutely for sure, like in Germany, there were people who were sabotaging the Nazis.
Yeah.
100%.
They were inside fucking it up.
Silent resistance, right? Mm-hmm. Silent resistance.
Sometimes that's what you have to do.
Hey. Mm-hmm. Yeah. Thank you all so much for joining us.
Thank you, everybody. Fuck Nazis.
Yeah. Oh yeah. Let's give one more resounding rowdy fuck Nazis. Fuck Nazis.
Fuck Nazis. What a good sign off.
Absolutely.
Yeah. Be safe out there.
Bye.
Bye-bye.
Thanks for listening to Slaying Monsters, the 40 in History podcast. If you like the podcast, there's a couple ways you can show your support. You can tell your friends, you can leave us a rating and review on your podcast platform, or you can head over to slayingmonsterspodcast.com and click on the Support Us button to leave a donation. For questions, suggestions, and other feedback, reach out to us, slayingmonsterspodcast@gmail.com, and stay up to date by following us on socials at Slaying Monsters Podcast. Your support helps us grow, and we are truly grateful to have our listeners and community.